what I was trying to do in Half Part to the Promised Land is to say, let's not tell a simplistic story of overcoming hard times in which the only people who matter are the people who survive and make it to the middle class. There are a bunch of people who have negative things happen to them that they don't overcome. And their lives are also instructive about what it means to be human and Christian in America.
Well, we have Esau McCaulley with us. He is associate professor of New Testament, Wheaton College, theologian in residence at Progressive Baptist Church, and also author of the award-winning book Reading While Black and children's book. Is it Josie Johnson or Hosey? Josie?
Oh, Josie Johnson's hair. That's my daughter's middle name.
That's awesome.
Josie Johnson's hair and the Holy Spirit.
Yeah. Also a writer for New York Times. Also appeared in The Atlantic, Washington Post, Christianity Today. Thanks so much for coming to the show.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I appreciate it.
So the book that we have in front of us is How Far to the Promised Land. And this is the beautiful book right here. And one black family's story of hope and survival in the American South. And, well, first of all, I just want to thank you for coming on board. You opened up the book with Luke 18, 9 through 13. It's a story of the Pharisees and tax collector. And just curious why you chose that verse to open up.
Well, actually, that verse opens it up because at the center of the book is the story of me and my father. And in 2017, my father died in a single car accident on the way from California back to the United States. He was a truck driver, and he was driving he was dropping off the load, and he was coming back to where we were in the South. And we don't know what happened. He just veers off the overpass down into the road below, and he's killed immediately. And after talking with my family, I'm an ordained clergy person, and it quickly becomes clear that my family wants me to do the eulogy, which was complicated because my father struggled with drugs and addiction, and he was in and out of our lives during most of my childhood, so I didn't know him well. And so if anyone has ever, well, maybe a lot of people who listen to this don't do this all of the time, but if you're a clergy person and you do a eulogy, what you do is you sit down with the family. You begin to try to get an understanding of the person, who they were, what they were about. And what began as a story to understand my father's life quickly became a story or an exploration of my wider family history. But because we were alienated, I didn't know a lot of the stories from that part of that life. And so in the course of all of that was me learning about him. And when I got ready to do the eulogy, this is how it relates to Luke 18. The passage that I chose for the eulogy that I preached was the Pharisee and the tax collector. And if you ask me the follow-up question as to why I chose that passage for the eulogy, then you get to hear a little bit more.
Okay, well then, why did you use that for the eulogy?
There we go. I'm taking over the interview already, because that's the important follow-up question, right? So, everybody knows the story of the Pharisee and the tax collector. It's one of these famous stories that we love in the church, because in the story, there is the Pharisee who comes into the temple and he kind of goes, I'm amazing. I do all of the right stuff. God, aren't you really lucky to have me on your team?
That's basically it. Yeah.
I mean, some of us are like that, right? Like, God really did. He won when he got me on the team. But then there's a second guy who comes in, who is the tax collector, the sinner in this story. And the tax collector, it says he wouldn't look up to heaven. He just beat his breast and said, God, have mercy upon me, a sinner. And Christians love this story because we can say to someone, it doesn't matter what you've done in the past, that at any moment you can come and you can begin again. And in some sense, that's true, that we're happy that people who live lives of sin now follow God. That's great news. But one of the things that we don't actually think about is what happened to all of the people whose lives were ruined and ripped apart by the tax collector. In other words, before the tax collector was converted, he was the person who collaborated with the empire. He was the one who would go to your house. He would go to your house with goons. He'd come in, because as you can imagine, people don't just give money to tax collectors because they ask them.
Yep.
So he'd have to come with his soldiers, and he would take the money from these families. And the only way to stay in business as a tax collector is to get a lot of money for your masters in Rome. And so he would not just take the regular cost. he take extra. And so week in, week out, year in, year out, he robbed people. He ruined lives. And so even though we're happy that he converted, if we think about it, we had to ask the question of what are the implications of the life that he lived before his conversion? And how do the people he hurt think about his conversion? It's almost like the Apostle Paul. When Paul gets converted, at first, nobody wants to hang out with Paul.
Yeah.
It's like,
he might kill me.
Yeah, he might kill me.
Yeah.
So like, I'm glad that you're saved, but I don't want to deal with you. And like, it's only Barnabas, whose literal name was encouragement, who was the only who would hang out with Paul at the beginning. And so the reason that the tax collector story is so important to me is that my father does, in some sense, have a spiritual renewal towards the end of his life. But I was trying to process, I'm glad that you kind of end up in that place. But what about the impact of your actions on the entirety of my life before that? And so one way to thinking about the book, How Far to the Promised Land, is an extended reflection on the people who suffer while one person goes through their extended warnings. And a lot of us have these ideas, right? People who wound us and they turn their lives around and we're happy for them, but it's still complicated. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. Because they hurt you. I mean, they
hurt you.
Yeah. And so how do you reconcile that? And how do you, it's hard to flush the past and just move on.
And one of the things that was really interesting, as a clergy person, you meet people on both ends of that story. In other words, people come to your congregation and they might be in a place in their adulthood where they really face the full implications of their actions. And as a clergy person, you say, you know what? It doesn't matter what you've done in the past. God can give you an opportunity to begin again. And you know that person from that moment all the way forward, which is one experience of them. But the people who knew them before have a different experience of them. And I've met people who are going through the process of disappointing the people who are around them. And so How Far to the Promised Land, one element of it is me and my family dealing with the implications of my father's absence. And part of it is a book about someone who actually isn't there, which is a really complicated story to tell.
You know, from there, you lead into a story of your son, Luke, and the Christian artist, recording artist Lecrae, as a way of sharing your heart, your intention for writing the book. Talk about that.
Yeah. So I was invited to go to speak at this event, and I was busy, so I said I wasn't going to be able to do it. But then they told me, well, Lecrae's going to be the other speaker. And my son and me are both fans of Lecrae. And that's a good way to get me to do something. If you say Lecrae's going to be there, in general, I'm probably like, get Lecrae first, and then you're going to get the rest of us to come after that.
Yeah.
And so me and Lecrae are sitting on the stage.
By the way, we made sure that Lecrae was in the studio over here.
Oh, he's here. Lecrae's going to blow.
And Sally said that was the only way we're going to get you.
Yeah.
My schedule is clear.
Tell him to text me back. Anyway, I'm just kidding. I haven't even texted him. I don't even know what I'm talking about. So the truth is, we're sitting in this auditorium, and we're talking about race and faith. Is Christianity good or bad in the struggle for justice and racial equality? And the question comes from the audience, and they ask the question, tell us about the most racist thing you ever experienced. And the purpose of that, I think the person from the audience, they had a good heart. They wanted to, if I told something that was bad enough, it would create empathy that would then inspire the audience to resist racism and injustice. But one of the things that happens when you tell a story like that is that it narrows down the Black experience to only suffering.
Oh.
And it doesn't tell the complexity of what it actually means to be Black in America. And it focuses mostly on me. In other words, it's almost like the television show. You know the star of the show is going to live, right? And so I'm going to go through some experience. It's going to be sad, and I'm going to overcome it. And in that kind of narrative, it places the person who survives as the hero of the story. And it makes it easy on the audience. The audience just has to kind of boo the racist, and then we finish the story. But what I was trying to say is, well, in order to understand what it's like to be Black in America, you don't just need the story of one racist event that one person overcomes. You actually need to know a community, a people, the variety of people who are in a community, and you need to know something about the history that leads to these events. These events don't just come out of nowhere. And so in part, what I was trying to do in Half Part to the Promised Land is to say, let's not tell a simplistic story of overcoming hard times in which the only people who matter are the people who survive and make it to the middle class. There are a bunch of people who have negative things happen to them that they don't overcome. And their lives are also instructive about what it means to be human and Christian in America. And I wanted to complicate simple narratives. One of the things that, and this isn't, I want to make sure I say this as best as I can. One of the things that you can either do is that you can attribute virtue to all poor people. But I was poor and I was mean, right? So you can be poor and mean. Or you can assume that all poor people are poor because they just didn't work hard enough. And that it's all individual effort and grit and determination can get you there. But I know a lot of determined people who didn't survive. I tell the story in the book of my grandmother, who was a tenant farmer, who did everything that America asked for her, even though she was not properly educated, because she grew up, great-grandmother, she grew up during Jim Crow, and they didn't think it was worth their energy to educate a Black woman. She picked cotton during the day. In the evening, she cleaned homes. And then she was a midwife. And in the 1920s, 1930s South, at the height of Jim Crow in Alabama, this Black woman managed to buy a plot of land. Like, that's the American dream, right?
Yeah.
So she did everything right. She worked hard. She saved her money. She bought the land. She did the stuff. But through a variety of circumstances that you can read about in the book, that land is eventually stolen from her. So the question is, like, well, what does that story reveal about America? Like, I had my events that happened to me. I overcame them. I made it to whatever you want to call the middle class. Is my story the only one that matters? Or do we need to wrestle with both of these stories? That I worked hard, my great-grandmother worked hard, we both wanted it really bad, and we had different outcomes. And so what I wanted to do in How Far to the Promised Land is to tell a bunch of stories, not just one story, that gives a fuller picture of what was going on in my community.
That's awesome.
Wow. It's just stunning to read your thoughts and follow that narrative that you chose to actually turn down that question that was asked of you and for these reasons that you stated. So I'm focusing on the fact that losing a family member I've experienced, it's typically life-changing. And for you, the passing of your dad and the need to present the eulogy, ultimately led to what you call ushering in a season of truth-telling. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that happens in our lives is that we leave a lot of things unprocessed, right? Bad things happen to us. We kind of go, oh, that's bad. And like, it hurts whenever we remember it, but we don't really know what to do with those feelings. And one of the things about having to stand up and talk about someone is that it forces you to actually face those feelings, right? In other words, things that I put aside, I had to wrap it up into a narrative. One of the things you do when you tell write a eulogy, you have to tell the story of that person's life, but you also have to wrap that story up in the wider purposes of God. In other words, if you're a Christian doing a eulogy, you're not just telling sentimental stories. You're saying, what is God up to in this life? And it was impossible for me to ask the question, what God was up to in my father's life, without trying to figure out what God was up to in my own life. And so it forced me to face that truth. But it wasn't just forcing me to face it. It was forcing me to come to grips with there's part to my story that I hadn't told even to my children. That, sometimes when you go through difficult things, you just put it in the closet where all of the bad memories go. And I felt like in order for my children to understand me, they need to understand some of the things I went through. A perfect example is, this may seem like something silly, but my father was never there when I went to my sporting events. And so whenever I like my kids have anything, I'm always going to be there. My son was at a quiz bowl, like a scholar bowl the other day. And I went there and I'm sitting as one of the 3 parents in the audience. Cause I mean, like I want to be there. But also it's like, there is this sense in which when you watch your children go through things, play sports, have concerts, you're almost experiencing each one of those things twice. You remember what it's like to be a kid whose parent wasn't there. So you like, it always brings you back to your childhood. So you can find yourself getting strangely emotional. I was playing basketball in the backyard with my son, and I was like, I just never had these kinds of innocent moments, and these things kind of get to you. And so I think that doing the eulogy, like, forced me to open up a part of myself, even in the writing of the book and the writing of the eulogy and the encounter with my kids, that I hadn't done before. And I think that all of us have these stories, these things that mark us, that we return to again. Maybe I'm weird. You all can tell me if this is true of you. These
You're
events
weird.
from your life that you. Thank you. Great.
No, I'm just kidding.
Thank you. I mean, I appreciate that. And I complimented you on your beard, and you called me weird. I can't believe it. Never coming back. But no, it's like these stories that come back to you, and so I feel like now talking about them has their own way of bringing healing.
I would think eulogizing your father, and you talk about some of the horrible stuff had done in your life. I mean, as a eulogy, you're supposed to say nice things about that person. And you're right. I think that does probably go through the jungle gym of emotion of everything that you went through. But then to figure out, okay, how do we frame this in the right way? That would have to be hard, really hard.
Well, actually, one of the things that happens is that learning about his life did frame it.
Yeah.
Now, one of the hard things to do is to keep intention to ideas. That we're responsible for our actions. That the things that we do, we are ultimately responsible for. But these actions don't just emerge out of nowhere. We're sometimes influenced by the circumstances around us. And when I found out that my father had been left by his father, and that his family, and that departure wasn't just because the guy didn't love his family, but there's something that happens that is so traumatizing in my father's childhood that it marks his life forever. And when I began to understand the things that he experienced as a child, it helped me understand who he became. And so that actually gave me some empathy. And so part of what was the difficult part of the eulogy, or making sense of any human life, is to hold these two things in tension. We make the decisions that we make, but we're also shaped by the things that we do. And my father was, for example, my father was told by his father that he was never going to be anything good, and he was only going to cause trouble and pain to the people around him. And how does that mark you when your dad tells you when you're a kid that you're no good? And how does it mark you when, because you can play sports in school, no one thinks to teach you how to really read and write, and he could read, but like they didn't put effort into educating him. They just passed him along. And what does it mean for him to kind of go to schools where, like, we're early post segregation, and he, as a black person, is kind of pushed to the side. So that doesn't change the things that he did, but it puts it in a context. And then when you say towards the end of his life, he does begin to think differently about God and how he wants to live his life. And all three of those things are true. Yeah. He made decisions, right, that had a negative impact upon us. The second one is, like, part of those decisions were shaped by the world around him. Third is he does begin to think towards the end of his life that maybe there's a different way to live, but that decision doesn't erase the past. And so one of the things that's really hard for us to do in our current culture is to hold into tension these things we want to separate into one: personal responsibility, or the wider problems of society leading us to engage in activities. And the truth is, I think that they're somewhat intertwined. And I tried to get at that in my father's story. But like you said, like my sister, when I get ready to write the eulogy, my younger sister Marquita said, I want Daniel, they call me Daniel, that's my middle name. She said, I want Daniel to do the eulogy because he's the only one who will tell the truth. And so one of the things that you probably know, like, don't ask me a question if you want to know the answer to the question. and so like, when they asked me to do it, they knew that it was going to be truthful, but not vindictive.
Yeah. It reminds me of, you've heard that hurting people hurt people.
Yes.
somehow they were hurt. Like, Misty,
Yeah.
your own father hurt you in a big way.
Oh, yeah.
And I guess I don't know if we even know what caused him to be the person that he is. But because you haven't really talked about
Yeah,
that. But
I know a small portion of his backstory, and you're right. Like, that definitely influenced him. You wrote this sentence, since you brought that up, that was a complete gut punch for me, because I don't think I'd ever framed what I did in my mind quite the way that you put it. And I'll preface this by saying my dad and I never had a relationship. He walked away when I was 6 months old. And I think in my mind, especially the last few years for sure, I really thought there was going to be this come to Jesus moment where he realized what he had done, and he was going to approach me, and he was going to apologize, and I was going to offer my forgiveness in that moment. Like, I was actually, I think, physically withholding the forgiveness, because this moment's going to happen, and then I can give it to him. Yeah. And then at the end of 2020, I did this random search for his name on the internet. He'd passed away a couple of years prior. I didn't even know. And so when you were talking about your mom and dad, and you wrote, I think that his whole life he was trying to prove a dead man wrong. And I went, oof, man. And obviously, like, our circumstances are what we've experienced vastly different. But I was like, that is such a profound phrase. How many of us can really relate to that? So many, I think.
Yeah, and I think that and for a long time, I was trying to prove a man who was alive wrong. In other words, one of the things that happens is I talked about it earlier, we are marked by these events even if we survive them. And so when I wanted to be, when I was a kid, before I even puberty, when I thought girls were still gross, right? I used to want to be a husband and a father. I really did. And the reason I wanted to be a husband and a father is because I had this idea. I don't even know where it came from. It's been with me for as long as I have a memory. I wonder what happens to a kid if his dad loves him. Because I knew what it felt like not to have that. And so for me, like, a working hypothesis of my entire life is, how would a childhood be different? And I'm a kid thinking about my future kid. Maybe I was a weird kid. But I said, because I knew how much it hurt. And I said, I wonder what it would be like if there was a kid who from the moment they were born knew that a parent loved them. What would it be like if there was a woman who every day she came home and her husband had something positive to say instead of something negative to say? And so for me, it was not necessarily trying to prove someone wrong. It was a hypothesis of a life, right? So in other words, as a kid, I'm feeling what I'm feeling about my life unfolding. And I'm also watching my mom. And I'm thinking, if you just change out this bad dad for a good dad, what happens to the equation? And so one of the things I had to ask myself this might be a weird question, forgive me. Like, why am I going to my kid's event? Am I going to my kid's event because I want to go to my kid's event? Or I'm going to this kid's event because I'm trying to prove to my dad that I can do what he didn't do? And the idea that, like, when you say, I'm going to be a good parent, I'm going to be there for my child. Well, is it for your child, or are you trying to relive your childhood without the trauma through your children? And so when my father was attempting to do that, in some sense, I was attempting to do that. And part of the book was me wrestling with that kind of tension of, are we free to become who God called us to be? Or are we trying to, in some sense, unwind some trauma that we haven't gotten over yet?
Wow, that's an interesting thought.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that thought of you replace this bad dad with a good dad, and what kind of a dad am I? Why am I a good dad?
Yeah. Well, you got to ask my kids whether or not I'm a good dad. It depends,
Exactly.
When we were watching the Lakers game last night, and I didn't let my son watch the fourth quarter, and I was immediately a bad dad.
That's right.
The ratings change momentarily.
Yeah. So
Yeah, man, my kids. I don't know. I'll let my kids are freshly offended every day at bedtime. It's like this is the same thing every day. Anyways, they're shocked. Like, how could you do this to me? Like, I do it every day. I'm committed to it.
Oh, it's so funny. You're writing about your family's story in this book, and so much of your childhood was emotionally difficult. And I'm just curious, how did this feel for you to deal with this as the story unfolded?
I mean, I tell people every book costs us something. Like, no book is free. I mean, every time you spend a couple of years of your life trying to wrestle ideas onto paper, and then you give them away to the world, there's always a cost associated with it. And sometimes the cost is just time and energy, just researching the topic and then writing about it. But sometimes the cost is an emotional cost. And I would say I paid a higher cost to write How Far to the Promised Land than anything I've ever written. And I can't imagine ever writing something that costs more, because what you're having to do is, in some sense, return to the most difficult parts of your life and to make sense of them. One of the ways that I think about this is the Joseph story. In the Bible, Joseph's entire life, is changed by the betrayal of the people closest to him. That's what happens, right? His family turns his back on him. But that betrayal, it's forever a part of Joseph's narrative. Whenever we tell the story of Joseph, it is Joseph's betrayal as his family, as this originating moment. And we all like to skip towards to the end of the Joseph story. Joseph says, what you meant for evil, God meant for good, to bring about the salvation of many people. But we notice though that Joseph doesn't say that the moment that he is like betrayed. He's like, why could you do this to me? And even when Joseph is in prison, he goes, I was sent here and I haven't done anything wrong. And so I want to imagine that for significant parts of Joseph's life, he wasn't there at that point where he can make that statement. I think that came from a lifetime of reflection on God was there in the midst of these things. And for me, part of me seeing God's hand in the things that happened to me occurred during the course of writing this book. The way that I like to talk about it is the stories that control us. All of us have fears, phobias, traumas, these things that we carry around with us as we go through the days, weeks, and months, and years of our life. And for significant points of our lives, these stories are in control. Like every time they come to us, the memories come back and we just try to survive it. Something triggers us. But sometimes in our life, we get to the point where our traumas, we control them and they become testimonies, right? In other words, instead of depressing us, we use the hard things for the glory of God. One of the things, the people who I've taken a lot of courage from is abuse survivors. Abuse survivors who are advocates, and this is not required for any abuse survivor to be an advocate. I want to be careful when I say this. There's some people who suffered abuse can take that experience and use it to become an advocate to help others. They've taken something that was evil and they now use that story to help other people. And for me, part of what was happening in this book was taking something that was evil and hopefully using it as a means to help people encounter God.
I love that. It's redemption. In fact, we hear it on our show all the time. Someone calls and says, I was an addict and now I'm helping people with their addiction.
Yes.
I mean, that to me is redeeming the negativity. Whatever happened to you, God's turning that and using that for his glory. And I mean, that's just beautiful. I mean,
he doesn't waste anything.
No, he doesn't.
Yeah.
You're right.
And the good thing about that is that we don't have to say that God caused these things to happen to us. In other words, God doesn't make someone an addict so he can then get them off of drugs and then have them go into addiction recovery ministry. What it is that even the worst parts of our lives, when wrapped up in the wider story of God, become a part of our testimonies. And part of what How Far to the Promised Land was turning those negative things into testimonies.
Wow. So How Far to the Promised Land, Esau McCaulley, one black's family story of hope and survival in the American South. You talk about how heroes are not just born, Now, heroes and villains, by the way.
Yeah.
Heroes and monsters. They're not just born, they are made. Talk about that.
That's what I was trying to get at. When you're a kid, the world is binary, right? There's good guys, bad guys. Superman, like Lex Luthor, whatever.
Yep.
And so my father was a bad guy. You know, he had addiction and he stole from our family. And that was all that he was to me. And when you're a kid, you can kind of think in that way. Once you get older and you begin to understand something like the nature of addiction, right? That it isn't simply a choice, that there's biochemical reactions that are related to the human body that makes it hard to get off drugs. When you begin to understand that, you know, people in some sense are shaped by the things that happen to them. I talked about it earlier. My father was abandoned by his father. And my father grew up in a context of a South that often kind of treated young black men in the 60s and the 70s as not being raised very much. And so what I thought of as a simplistic story of a bad person was someone who had a complex set of circumstances that helped inform him. And this is the thing where you have to remain Christian about it. Just like and I think this is really important. Empathy for someone's situation does not necessarily negate accountability. And so I was empathetic for what my father experienced, but he still chose to take the drugs.
Yep.
And keeping those things in balance was a part of it. And so the idea of the making of a villain is that villains often have origin stories. Some people are just mean, but a lot of times villains have origin stories. And learning about my father's origin story and how he ended up where he did explained a lot to me.
I like that because it's not excusing the wrong, but when you look at our world and the way it is, and you don't have a choice as to who your parent is for you, or how they were raised, you can sort of see why someone might become the way they are.
Yeah,
doesn't mean it's right, but it makes sense. Yeah.
One of the things that I think that we have to struggle with is, as Christians, to keep tender hearts. Because one of the hard things is there's so many broken people in the world, and there's so much pain. And one of the ways to manage that pain is to close ourselves off from it. And to say everybody who is the way that they are, who aren't as successful as me, are that way because of bad decisions they made in their life. And that's actually a very helpful ideology to have because it absolves you of all responsibility. All you have to do is say, like, make better decisions.
Yeah.
But if you say, you ever thought about this? Maybe this is just me. Like anyone who you see who's homeless right now, right? An adult who's homeless. They were at one point some elementary school kid possibly playing in the backyard with their other kids. Like most people kind of don't plan to end up homeless. Well, what series of decisions and events led to that place? And those kinds of empathy opens you up to be of help, but it also opens you up to be manipulated. And so that fear of, if I care about these things, I will help people who will manipulate me or hurt me or wound me again, makes it seem like the safest thing to do is to close your heart to empathy. And so what I want to say is, it's true that Christians who are empathetic, we get hurt a lot. But part of what I think it means to be a Christian is that because we can't stop hoping, we will always experience disappointment for the people who don't take advantage of their opportunities. But I just don't think that closing yourself off from hope and empathy is a healthy way of being a Christian, because it turns you into a cynic, which means that you have to begin to always answer the question, how does someone end up where they did? And if I understood how they get there, then maybe I could help them begin to think of a way out of it, even if they ultimately don't choose it. Because the truth is, like, a lot of people who you try to help won't actually change.
Yeah.
I know you have like a radio show, right? You know, you have a beginning, a middle, and an end. We grew up, I think we're of the same age, where we watched the TV shows where it'd be a 30-minute sitcom and the kids would have a problem at the beginning of the sitcom, and by the end, the problem was resolved, and it never came up again, right?
Wouldn't it be great if life was like this?
Yeah, life was like that.
We were all the Brady Bunch.
The kids hooked on drugs in the first episode, and Dad says drugs are bad. He go, "Great, Dad, I'm clean forever." Right? The drug episode. And so, but life isn't like that, right? You can't have the big speech that solves everything. It lingers over and over and over and over and over again. And part of what it means to be, I think, a Christian is to just understand that that's what it means to bear with people who are broken.
Boy, you brought me back to my childhood watching Different Strokes. And someone's got it.
Are we thinking of the same one where she had bulimia?
Yeah.
Oh, well, there was Nancy
for like an
Reagan.
episode.
Okay.
Nancy Reagan came on the show and just said no to drugs, and that was solved the whole
Remember
thing.
that. There was an episode where the daughter was like cured of bulimia in 30 minutes.
Yeah, in 30 minutes, like she's done.
Never had a problem again.
And that's the reason why you said you saved the speech. Because we're like, oh, I know the speech. I've seen it in the movies. When do I get to give the speech? That's this idea that life is buttoned up.
Yeah.
One of the things that I talk about in the story is I had an aunt who is dying of AIDS. And we go into the hospital. This is like in the movies, right? You go into the hospital because she's my cousin. She's meant a lot to me. Well, I should have the speech. I should have the speech ready. I should say the things that are articulate that I could then quote in a book because I'm just like shockingly emotionally aware kid who can say these things. But I watch my cousin who's dying and I don't say a word because I don't know what to say. And I just leave. And the truth is, like, life isn't like television. The conclusions are often unsatisfactory. There's another story that I tell about when I was playing football and I tear 3 ligaments in my knee. And I was Christian, right? So I read all these stories in the Bible about how God heals people. And I go, okay, well, I need a healing because football's my way to college. So I pray to God like they do on television and movies and in the Bible. And I like get on the crutches because whenever the person is healed, they start on the crutches and they put the crutches away and then they kind of walk. So I stand up, I have the crutches, I put the crutches away and I try to walk them.
Don't do it.
I did it. It's too late. I'm sorry. It happened 20 years ago. And I fall on the ground. Because that's not how life works.
Yeah.
And one of the hard parts about telling a Christian story, there's a bunch of incidents like that in the book, is that like what might be the Disney happy ending where God just swoops in and resolves the problem doesn't often occur. Part of what it means to be a Christian isn't that God comes in and solves every problem, but that God makes the hard parts of our life survivable. And that he's with us as a friend, even when it's difficult.
Yeah, that's beautiful. We have my wife and I have a daughter diagnosed with multiple special needs. She's in a wheelchair. She's got cerebral palsy. And it's been like taking care of a 3-month-old for now 20 years. Yeah. And my wife, I encourage her. She's got so many experience regarding this to write a book. She says, yeah, but it doesn't have an happy ending. And I said, well, I think that's refreshing. It's okay.
That's the point.
Yes,
that's the point.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's the point. And I think that one of the things that we don't recognize is God's delight in our persistent faithfulness. And I think that we believe that God's delight is seen when God at the end says, here's the thing that makes it all go away. I talk about the story of the Pharisee and the tax collector for that reason. Even though the tax collector is converted at the end, he still has an entire life of trauma and mistakes. That's just part of what it means. In other words, we don't always get the solution to the problem that makes all of the hard parts go away. What I think is important is to say that even in the hardest parts, God is with us. And that sometimes the only lesson that we learn from a hard situation is precisely that God gives us a strength that we didn't know that we didn't have, until he supplied it to us when we needed the most. And that's a hard lesson. I mean, trust me, if I wrote a book that said, here's 10 ways to solve any hard problem and turn it into, like, I don't know, success and happiness, I probably would have sold a bunch of more copies of How Far to the Promised Land. But that's not true, right? Like, I think that we've have enough books where we lie to people. I think we need to have stories that are honest and true about what it means to be a Christian. Sorry, I know I'm rambling on about this, but I remember when I was a kid. I mean, I'm 44, but I remember when I was younger. I thought the hard part of being a Christian was over, right? So you're 18, you try to figure out, am I going to be a Christian in college? That feels like a big decision to make. Am I going to keep my faith? And I said, oh, I did it. I graduated from college and I still love God. And then a woman was crazy enough to marry me, and I have a wife. Oh my goodness. I'm married and I'm Christian and I'm in my 20s. And I thought, oh, I'll just rinse and repeat this for 50 years and then I'll go to glory. That's what I thought, right? But I didn't realize all of the challenges that still awaited me post-decision, I'm going to stay Christian, post-marriage, right? There's an entire life with God that is sometimes just hard. And writing about that isn't the most, like, easily digestible, but I think it's true.
You know, so profound is it, our perspective on the journey that God has us on. And I think that's what touched me to the core. If I was to sum up why I was so moved and am so moved by your book, Esau, is your perspective. I relate to living with my sister who struggled with addiction until God took her to glory. From 7th grade and really probably started long before that. And then ultimately to her going into the arms of Jesus at the young age of 46. But boy, did it feel like 3 lifetimes of living through that with her. And so when it came time for me to do her eulogy, I really related to your journey you had to take to go back and understand who she is and present her not as this addicted person that everybody had seen for the last many years, but there was a whole nother Linda that people didn't know. And it was my job to tell her story. And at the end, I remember my final words being, and that is worth our tears. Yeah. And somebody actually walked up to me, somebody very close to me who shouldn't have done it, but said, you should never be ashamed of your sister. And I was just taken aback, like she had slapped my face. I was like, out of all of that, I hope you heard.
One of the things that I don't...
No being ashamed of somebody's struggle, that God has given me a whole different perspective. And so I'm touched that you did that. You went back and you felt those feelings and you told the story of your dad. You told the truth, as you said.
One of the things that I don't think we think about, because it doesn't make for, I don't know, good Christian conversation, is the fact that addicts are Christians. Or can be Christians.
She loves the Lord.
And so
we have
tend to
some
think
that will call our show and say, I did drugs this morning and I'm listening to you right now for hope.
Yeah.
And so listen, what I'm trying to say is we think of the Christians who, and listen, I want everyone who struggle with addiction to get free. I don't want to diminish that. But we tend to think of the Christian as the person who wins at the end. That it kind of resolves into moving into the suburbs. But some people love Jesus and struggle their entire lives. The entire lives. And their faith is as genuine as we can imagine. But they don't have the tools, the resources. Like, things happen, they make it. And what I want to say is, obviously there's a broken part of that testimony, but there's something else going on there. And how do we make sense of Christian lives that are fundamentally messy without normalizing and pushing away? I'm not saying this, but like, there are people, God is at work in the lives of addicts. And because addicts don't normally get to write books until they get clean, right? The only people who can tell the story of God's work in the life of an addict who remains an addict for most of their lives are the people who observe it. And when I talk about like refusing to tell my story and forefronting my father's and other people's story, is that both of these stories are America. The story of America is a young black kid who grows up in poverty, deals with racism, survives it, goes to college, makes it into the middle class. That is America. There's also America where there's a black guy who gets addicted to drugs when he's a teenager, struggles with making sense of his life, goes back and forth, clean, unclean. And in the context of that, he's struggling with make sense of God as well. Both of those stories are true. And both of those stories are instructive about the human experience. And I wanted to tell both of them in the same narrative because it's the father and the son. The title that they rejected because it was too cute was the last chapter before the eulogy, and the book is called Fathers and Sons Revisited. And I wanted to name the book Fathers and Sons Revisited, but they said that was too cute. So it ended up being How Far to the Promised Land. But the idea of the father and the son who are both journeying through America, making different decisions, having different outcomes, is a central theme. And me telling that story in a way that's empathetic and you doing the same thing, I think is important for people to see.
Yeah. Yeah. Amen.
We've talked a lot about your dad and that situation. And I would love to focus on your mom.
Yes, there we go.
For a second. So I tell you, I mean, our circumstance is vastly different, but my mom, the reason that she walked away from my dad and he in turn walked away from me, he was abusive. Yeah. And I am so grateful that I did not grow up in that environment. I don't even think now I can possibly understand the strength that it took. I don't myself have children, and so I don't really know the struggles of a single mom trying to provide. I know she had a lot of trouble, even though she had help from our grandparents, my grandparents, her parents. But man, the heart of a mom who loves her kids and wants to provide and the things that she will do. Your mom overcame a lot to take care of y'all.
My mom did the same thing. She did it a little bit later than your mother did. She left an abusive situation eventually as well. And one of the things that happened is that it sent us tumbling down the economic ladder, which is a fair trade. I don't want to make it seem like I regret it, but I mean, of course that's happened. And so you got to ask the question, if there's a star of the book, he's a hero of the book. It's actually not me. It's my mother. Yes. Because one of the questions one of the things you have to do as a single mother who's raising 4 kids is you deal with a stereotype. Everybody just thinks that you're like some kind of welfare queen who doesn't work hard or who doesn't, care about her family or who's promiscuous. There's all these things. And she lived with dignity despite those stereotypes. But beyond that, it's about, and maybe this is one of the things that even influences me as a writer. One of the things that my mother did was form our imagination. Because when you live in a society and a culture that tells you all of the time, you're a child of a single mom, you're just going to end up dead or in drugs or, in prison. And when everyone tells you that you're not going to, we were in a rough part of town, the school was bad. And so the idea, the fact that my entire life, I always knew I was going to go to college was because she convinced us. And I don't know, if I could figure out the alchemy, I would. She convinced us that we could be whatever it was that God had called us to be. And that if we trusted in him, he will handle our future. And the ability to instill hope in hopeless places is an achievement worthy of a Nobel Peace Prize, if I was going to be honest. When I used to serve in this church in Norfolk, Virginia, there was a neighborhood down the road that was really dirty. It had like trash everywhere. And someone said that, before you all began to do evangelistic work, you should clean the place. Like you should just go there as servants and begin to pick up the trash, because when an area is beautiful, it makes it sometimes easier to hear the voice of God. When an area is dirty, it's kind of like the physical landscape of the place pulls down your spirit. You ever been that? You've been into a place, you walk right in, and the community itself makes you feel uncomfortable.
I drive through those sometimes.
No, but it's the physical landscape, right?
Oh, absolutely.
The landscape itself. And so when you say to someone, like, if you live in a landscape where it presses down on your hope by the way it looks and the things that happen there. Well, then what kind of person does it require to inspire someone in that context? It's kind of easy if it's easy because every life is hard. But if you live in a middle class neighborhood and the trees are lined and everybody's nice and the people wave at you and things are great, like the possibility of having a hope for your future is insignificant. Like my kids all assume they're going to go to college. We got to get them to do homework, right? Because everybody they know goes to college. Everybody they know their families have went to college, and the atmosphere into which they inhabit is one of success. And so success is not a feat of the imagination. It is accessible. Failure is actually the harder thing for them to access. What do you mean I can end up not okay? Everybody I know is okay. But if you live in a context where nobody is okay, well, then what kind of woman can inspire someone to believe that which they can't see? And my mom, she did that, not just by her own, but by keeping us knee deep in church every Sunday. If you ever went to a black church, you're there from like 9 to 1. Maybe that's the solution. You just take them to Sunday school and put them in church all day.
Keep them in a pew.
You don't have any time to do anything bad. You're in church.
Yeah. So I remember when I was a kid. Forgive me, Pastor. I gotta apologize to him. But I used to live in Alabama, and the football game would start at 1 o'clock or noon. And I wanted to get home to watch the afternoon game. And the pastor would like issue the invitation. And if a bunch of people started getting saved, it's like, man, I'm going to miss the first half. Because then he wants to give like their testimonies and everything. I was like, man, let's say Jesus saved you. I'm going to miss the game. And that's just one time.
Wrap it up.
God punished me. I think God did this to me. I took it as a personal rebuke. There was one time, you'll remember this if you're the right age, when Dallas and San Francisco were really good, when they had like the Cowboys are good, and they had Joe Montana and everything. And it was like the game for the NFC Championship, like the number 1 seed. I was like, I got to get to this game. And like 20 people became a Christian. It was and the pastor goes, I want to order food for the entire congregation. We're going to sit here and have testimony. I'm like, no. No. I missed the whole game.
Oh, it's so funny. Oh, man.
I was a kid. I didn't know. I was like, I should have been celebrating the salvation of souls. I will confess that as a kid, I wanted to go home and watch football. God have mercy upon my soul.
I'm a firm believer, Esau, that my dad finally bought a VCR to remedy what you just talked about. I remember him coming home from church and hitting rewind on the tape.
There we go. See, I wish you had. See, where was your dad when I was a kid? He used to sit one at my house. We didn't have a VCR.
Oh, my word.
Oh, that is so funny. Oh, my gosh. Thank you so much.
Yes.
This is
We could talk for 3 more hours, right?
This really is a page turner. If people are, I think the truth is this. It's sort of like being married, or you don't know what it's like until you've been there. But obviously, I don't know what it's like to go through what you've been through, or to be African American for that matter either. And so I think this is really paints a picture of what it's like, but it's redeeming. Yeah. It really is.
Yeah.
Oh.
And so.
Thank you. I think that we're not closed off from the world.
Yeah.
I think that anytime someone tells a true human story, even if we come from radically different circumstances, we can connect.
Amen.
So even though all of us come from different circumstances, we can all talk about like the wounds of our family. We can all talk about disappointment. And I don't think that any human is closed off. I think that with empathy, we can begin to understand each other's stories. And so I'm glad that you took the time to listen to mine, and I'm glad that you found it helpful.
That's good. That's good. We like to end our interviews with one question. What brings you joy?
Okay. My children.
Hey, good answer.
My children, the simplistic joys of watching my children's life unfold in front of me is really good. I tell people sometimes I have to travel to speak, and I say, you don't pay me to come and speak. I would do that for free. You pay me to leave my family.
Yeah.
That's you have to convince me to leave this wonderful group of people that I get to spend my life with. So what gives me joy is my wife and my kids. We just had this really lame. Sorry, you're gonna judge me, but we buy matching pajamas every year for Christmas. And my daughter just can't wait to put them on. And so we have you got to wait till at least after Thanksgiving. So we have this the last day of the old jammies, and then the transition to the new jammies. And she
So
the younger, she's over the moon.
That's
And seeing her put those on and taking pictures, we did that a few weeks ago, but that's sticking out as a particularly joyful moment. So my kids always make me happy.
That's a blast. By the way, family is usually in the 90th percentile of the answer.
Yeah.
Most people,
There we go.
they say family. Thank you so much for your time. Really
You're
appreciate it.
welcome. Anytime. You have a great day.
How Far to the Promised Land, one black family's story of hope and survival in the American South. Esau McCaulley. Appreciate you. Have a great day.
I appreciate you.
All right.
And you have a great day too.
Take care.